Hey everyone, I wanted to make this video today with a little bit of a different tone than some of the other videos. So I'm a vegan. I'm definitely vegan for life. I think veganism is a very important statement that we make in support of anti-speciesism. And that's really an important distinction that I think the animal rights movement throughout its entire existence has really failed to make. I think the animal rights movement as a whole has really failed in its messaging for the entirety of its existence, and I really want to draw that out here because I've seen plenty of examples which I want to demonstrate and show here today, where I think we actually can really connect with pretty much anybody around a message that focuses on a system rather than focuses on individual consumerism. So what you're looking at now is actually segment from Nuance Bro. This guy goes around and interviews folks at different protests, and he talked to me at this rally to ban fur in San Francisco, and he is definitely tends to be right-leaning, right-wing, as well as his audience tends to be, and just kind of tooting my own horn here, but I think for a good reason. If you look at the comments section here, extremely positive, extremely receptive in a way that again, right-leaning folks very rarely are towards animal rights activists. You see the top comment there, Arc Guy, which is me, I'm wearing my Berkeley Animal Rights Center shirt. Arc Guy was pretty based and for what I could consider fairly nuanced, bro. For people who may not know, based is this term that means that you're very true to yourself and you're very authentic and you're just a generalized compliment, as I understand it. All right, you see some comments in here, mixed in, but again, like a lot of very positive ones. This comment here, notice that all these people are willing to talk to you. That would not happen if they were all SJWs. I'm not endorsing everything that's said in this comment here, but in general, it's very positive. And the last thing that said, I support Trump, make America great again. So we have a Trump supporter here who, has some good things to say about us, and that was a highly ranking comment as well. Scrolling down a bit further here, although I disagree with these people, they were very articulate and knew their positions. Great interviews. A few more comments down. Please make it your mission to seek out more people like the Art Guy in future protests. These are solid arguments we need to hear, whether we're for or against them. They foster respect for the other side and make it easier for the opposition to be curious to listen and reflect on. Next comment underneath that, the guy in the maroon shirt did a great job advocating for animal rights. And you kind of scroll down. The Art Guy was pretty legit. I eat meat and whatnot, but at least he made sense. The comment under that, the guy in the burgundy ARE, is actually ARC, shirt, had really good feedback on your questions. He spoke with a lot of reasonable answers and was very polite and honest. I like interviews that show how humans can interact so calmly and speak and express themselves without hate or ignorance. And so again, I say this to really emphasize what's possible if we have this right message. And so to really draw out this distinction of individual consumerism, which is what people are hearing with this go vegan message, and on one hand, I think it's very intuitive. It makes so much sense to people, like, hey, you want to say we shouldn't be using animals shouldn't be property. Well, don't use animals and get other people to not use animals and just multiply that times 8 billion and our work is done here, right? It just makes so much sense. It's so intuitive. It just seems like such a natural thing to just do and to spread, go vegan world, and we're done. But you run into problems in the real world because, as we all know, speciesism is this massive systemic issue that extends far beyond our own consumer choices. It extends far beyond food choices. And it just permeates everything we do, including vegan food choices. And so that's what you see in these arguments from somebody, like a Piers Morgan or like a Joe Rogan. And, they're kind of showmen and we get that. But on some level, these are people who are having real conversations. These are people who want to inspire a dialogue. And it's not, they're in a different category than, someone who's just being, someone who shouts bacon at a protest or whatever, somebody who's just being rude, dismissive, cognitive dissonance, and they're not having a conversation. Somebody like Joe Rogan has conversations with people all the time, literally like many hours a week. He's just like kicking around ideas. And Joe Rogan has literally come to the honest conclusion that vegans are irrational hypocrites. And that's a product of, because what he's hearing is, this consumerist message is like, hey, go vegan and you're perfect. And Joe Rogan's response to that is, well, I go in my backyard and I shoot an elk. and I consume elk flesh, and it's 200 pounds of an elk, and I take one life and I have 200 pounds of food, versus the vegan who's who knows what, sourcing their quinoa from South America, and there's pesticides, and there's exploitative labor, and there's CO2 emissions to fly it up here, and do we really think that 200 pounds of an average vegan's food is better than me killing one elk? And so Joe Rogan has come to this conclusion that vegans are irrational hypocrites, and the reason he's done it is because he's never really heard this systemic message and saying, yes, vegans cause harm to other animals. Vegans, we're all entrenched in the species system in so many ways, and veganism is not the be-all end-all. Veganism is in fact just a way to make a statement, a social and political statement in support of anti-speciesism. So I'm going to say more on that, but first I want to jump into that actual interview that I told you guys about that got all those positive comments. So I'm going to walk you through that. We're going to play through the segment. It's about 5 minutes long, where I was interviewed, or it's a piece of that segment, and I'll comment it as we go through.
Do you feel like things like leather and wool are also included in that? Well, they are. I think from a philosophical or a moral perspective, there is no distinction to be made there. From, you are exploiting a living, feeling individual for your own use against their consent. So from a moral perspective, they're very much the same. Now, from a political perspective, from a legislative, reality on the ground perspective, there is a big distinction there. And we've already seen a ban on fur in West Hollywood. Earlier this year, a ban on fur in Berkeley. So this is something that is more politically salient and doable, whereas something like leather and wool are something that's more seen as a mainstream thing. So that's certainly on our radar, but it's further down the road. So, for example, let's say an animal's already dead, because the whole objection is we're killing a living being or using them. What if it's already dead and you're just procuring, maybe you found it or something, or it got old and it died, or would that be as objectionable, or what's going on?
All right, so now this question is a prime example here. What if you have an animal that died and you were to consume them? Now, one way to answer that question is just to be like, no, oh my God, that's horrible. Don't eat animals. Animals aren't ours to use. We shouldn't be eating animals. And that what you're kind of saying there is go vegan. And what a person who's focused on, a person like this interviewer, a person like Joe Rogan would say is like, well, what's the actual harm in that? If we're literally just zoomed in on these personal individual consumer choices only, and we're not thinking about the big picture, we're not thinking about the speciesism as throughout society, then they're just like, well, what the heck does it matter just consuming this one animal? So it's really important to answer that question in terms of anti-speciesism, in terms of the way we redefine the system. So I'll play the response here.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably some sort of a gray area. I mean, I think it's kind of weird, and it kind of sets a little bit of a bad precedent. I mean, I don't know, we could go around and start using dead human skin, people want to eat humans that are dead, that's pretty strange and kind of sets a bad precedent of using human beings or using non-human beings as objects. So, as a matter of principle, I think we probably stay away from it, but it's technically some kind of gray area if we were literally just talking about that.
And things like wool, for example, like most of these sheep, these domesticated sheep, they just keep growing the wool and wool until it's sheared off of them. And if it's not cut off, then they can die from heat stroke. They're immobilized, for example. So is that more of like is that okay to use, for example?
Careful.
So he asked about sheep and the way sheep are just bred to produce all this wool, and we have to shear them. Now, if one way to answer that question would be to say, well, they're actually not treated well. Have you seen some of these videos? They're treated horribly, or just go back to animals aren't property. You shouldn't use them because they're not property, and to avoid the systemic problem. And again, that would shut down somebody like a New Huntsbro, somebody like a Joe Rogan, if you just are just sticking to your dogma, your consumerism, and you're like, no, we're not using them. They're not objects. End of. And instead, again, just go to the systemic issue and just to be like, okay, well, I can appreciate if you say what we have to do. So I'll play my response to that.
In that very isolated circumstance, you can kind of zero in on the small picture and say, yeah, we need to shear the sheep for the sheep's individual good. But what we really need to focus on is the big picture. How do we get into this circumstance? How we got into this circumstance is speciesism. It's thousands of years ago, somebody found a wild animal and we started breeding them to serve our needs. And yes, we have through generation after generation of exploitation and violence from humans, we've created these animals who are dependent on humans in many different ways. So yeah, in the short term, just like with a dog on the street, or just like, in a lot of circumstances, like, we need to do what we need to do for the care of those individuals. But what we really need to do in a broader sense is to shift the narrative around our interaction with these animals and the relationship we have. We need to stop looking at it as what do we get out of them, and we need to come at it from a big picture sense of helping them, not enriching ourselves.
Sure. But in the sense of helping them, it does help them to shear off the wool. So wouldn't it be smart to actually use that and recycle instead of just throwing it away and wasting whatever there is?
And so again, he comes back to it, and this is going to be a perspective people haven't really heard. So he's like sort of and again, I think he's coming from a good place, but I think it's just like you sort of like really just need to like slow down and bring people to this systemic message. And he's just like, yeah, but it's for the sheep's own good. Like, you need to do this. And then it's like, well, as long as you're doing it, as long as you have the wool, like, you might as well use the wool. And so again, like, just like refocusing that on the systemic message, like, okay, whatever you're doing in your individual consumer choices, that's one thing, but speciesism at large and what we're normalizing, what we're not normalizing as far as animal use versus animal rights, always just recentering that in every way.
Yeah, I mean, in the very immediate term sense, that's a reasonable thing to do.
Maybe just control, like, make it a humane process instead of like just trying to shear them as quickly as possible and injuring them and things like that.
The way he came with that question is that it came back to saying, like, well, wait a second, make it a humane process. And so then he's kind of shifted from like helping this one individual to like, making the process itself, something that we should be reproducing and recreating, and just make it a humane process. So it's shifted from, help this one individual, which we should be doing, versus like normalizing and perpetuating this process of continued exploitation of animals, which we don't support as part of an anti-speciesist ethic.
I appreciate that perspective, but I actually disagree, because there is a fundamental difference in a world where we look at animals as objects that we can use and abuse, versus a world where we respect animals as the living, feeling individuals which we know them to be.
What if they're companions, like it's your companion animal and you want to help shear them, but you also use them to procure your own clothing, or you make it for other people and sell it and make a business out of that, but they're still companions that you value and love and everything like that?
Yeah, I mean, if in a circumstance where we end up with an individual who is in need of our help, then we help them. I mean, the same as we do, frankly, with human beings who are, might have some sort of disability and they need our help. So we put them, in some sort of, place where we can help them. But it should not be the objective. If we really wanted to be helping animals, we don't breed them to where they're, getting all this wool where they're uncomfortable. Or, we hear the similar argument with dairy where they're producing all this milk. Well, that didn't just happen by accident, right? That's so fundamentally, our relationship with animals should be one where we're helping them, and any benefits that we happen to get are incidental. Just like when we, if there's a human being who's disabled and needs help, you might find some fulfillment in helping them, but it's not coming from like, okay, let me find how this disabled human being can enrich me. That's not where that conversation starts.
And so I think that's another good thing to do is to just really just draw on the parallel logic that we have, and just say, this is the way we interact with human beings, and there's not a reason that this logic wouldn't apply. And so so to conflate, helping an individual and then also like using them in some way, like we don't say that's okay with human beings, and just to really, get out of muddying that water where it's just like, well, what in this one instance, if you're doing this nice thing for a person who you're also, being discriminatory towards and exploiting and using, and it's just like to draw that out, that like broadly, like, no, like the discrimination, speciesism, that's the thing that we need to oppose on a systemic level.
And one more question. I see a few like PETA sponsored signs. Are you a supporter of PETA?
In a broad sense, yes. I mean, we can always talk about specific tactics here or there that I wouldn't agree with, but PETA has done wonderful things for animal rights. Frankly, put animal rights on the map. This is a thing that nobody even practically heard of decades ago. So absolutely, in a big picture sense, we need collaboration and unity against speciesism and against animal agriculture, and PETA is a big part of that.
And I've also heard things like when they take animals into shelters, they end off killing a lot of them. What about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's a really difficult question, and I'm not going to say I agree with everything PETA does. If there are animals that in the society we have, there's not the resources, the infrastructure to, I don't know. It's an extremely difficult question with no great answers, and I can't confidently endorse any solution to that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And so with the PETA, there's actually, I could have expanded on that a bit further to again recenter the systemic issue here, because when you say like, oh, PETA is killing off these animals, and I guess for people who don't know, the quick backdrop on that is that PETA has taken a controversial stance whereby they are killing, euthanizing certain dogs, like pit bulls, that are overpopulated and many times injured and sick. And some people are saying that PETA isn't making a good faith effort to rehome them. And what we really want to get to with a question like that, again, is what's the systemic issue here? And the systemic issue here is that we live in a society which deprioritizes animal interests, and it deprioritizes non-human lives such that we have a crisis like this. And what we really need to do is to not point the finger, again, at individuals making consumer choices, or even individual organizations like PETA who have limited resources, and to say that as a society, as a culture, we need to be logically consistent and not discriminate, and to value sentient life everywhere it exists. And that really is how we solve this problem, instead of like nitpicking a specific policy that PETA has. And so that's the end of that interview. And once again, I just think if we look at the folks out there, like the Pierce Morgans, like if folks have seen some of these debates lately, Pierce Morgan is all about well, what about, do you eat bread? And then there's insects that are killed in the harvesting of bread. And when we get bogged down in these, kind of greater harm versus less harm arguments, that's a argument for a degree of harm. And so, well, if you're arguing for a degree of harm, like, oh, veganism might be right here, and maybe factory farming meat is over here, but then Joe Rogan says that killing an elk is over here, then it's just really muddy. And like, why are we drawing an arbitrary line somewhere in the spectrum and protesting vehemently for this one arbitrary line instead of really bringing it back? And ultimately, we are all speaking the same language. It's just the way that language is communicated. And when we know we're talking to people who are already kind of, on the defensive, who already have that cognitive dissonance built up, we need to really be thoughtful about the message that we're delivering and make it, something that can be heard as readily as possible by somebody like that. And once again, looking at, that comment section, again, that's just like a small sample size, but I've had many experiences in real life that aren't documented like that to demonstrate it. But if you see, you look all over YouTube, there's all these like vegan cringe compilations, and there's just so many people who again, in good faith, think vegans are irrational hypocrites because they're just hearing the wrong message. And so I think, really being thoughtful with our message is the way to go. And with speciesism itself, there are just so many more layers that, frankly, even animal advocates really seem to not be looking at a lot of the time. And so when we can open up this conversation, well beyond our individual choices, well beyond our food systems, into animals that are suffering in the wild, and so much far beyond not harming them, is that we can actually move and proactively help them. And really open up that dialogue to the depth and to the breadth of what it really is. And it really starts with legislative change and political change for animal personhood. So I think it's really important that we take a good hard look at ourselves and realize that the animal rights movement has really come to a halt in many ways. So while we've seen an increase in vegan products and vegan options, we see a vegan ad at the Super Bowl, we also see an increase in meat consumption. So we've seen in the first world, not only as a collective, but on a per capita basis, meat consumption is actually on the rise in the United States. And while there's been more vegan options, this conversation about the property status of animals is not meaningfully shifted in the direction of personhood. And so I really think we need to be taking a sober look at where we've been and where we're going. And I think our messaging is a good place to start.